Hey everybody, Dr. Wright here again. I decided to adjust our assignment a bit this week and add Vergil's Aeneid Book 4 to it, so I'm going to upload this video today, Sunday the 26th, covering Book 4, which is the last part of the first third of the epic, and will conclude Aeneas's stay in Carthage, though not in a happy way. So, we're going to focus, of course, on Dido and Aeneas today. This is a book where Aeneas, to many of you, will not come off well. That's something we can talk about at the end of the week. So, in our last couple of lectures, especially on Book 2, we talked about the imagery of darkness and shadow. So now, turning to the fourth book of the Aeneid, let's take a quick look at how that same darkness and shadow imagery, remember that big important book on the Aeneid is Darkness Visible by Ralph Johnson. Let's see how that plays out in Book 4. So at the very beginning, Dido, the book starts focalized on Dido now that Aeneas has concluded his story about his wanderings. So Vergil begins, Book 4. But the queen, long sick with love, nurses her heart's deep wound with her pounding blood, and dark flames lick at her soul. Thoughts of Aeneas, the man's noble lineage, his noble character, his heroic lineage, his noble character, flood her mind. His face and words transfix her heart, and her desire gives her no rest. So dark flames, I try to emphasize in reading it. There's our darkness and shadow again. There's that very bit, darkness visible, which comes, that phrase, darkness visible, comes from Milton's epic Paradise Lost. It's how he describes hell before Satan raises the Pandemonium Palace. Remember, I read you the opening proem to Paradise Lost in class before break. So, of course, where does Milton get that image? He gets it from here in Vergil's Aeneid. And Caeco igni is our Latin there. So you've got igni, our word for fire, and Caeco, which you might have learned as a vocab word Latin 1 or Latin 2, meaning blind. The famous Appius Claudius Caecus, Appius Claudius the blind, is an example of this. You've got that blindness, darkness of this hidden wound. And remember, who gave her this wound? Aeneas' mother, Venus, via Cupid, who is standing in for Ascanius, his cousin, or his nephew rather, because Cupid would be Aeneas' brother, stepbrother, to make sure that Juno, who is a big fan of Carthage, isn't up to something. But of course, she is up to something. And this wound from Venus and brought into Juno's machinations is going to spell tragedy for Dido. Berlioz's great opera, Les Troyens, the Trojans, it actually only really covers the first four books. Its culmination, its climax, appropriate for an opera, is the narrative of Book 4 and the doomed love affair of Dido and Aeneas. But also think about what we talked about last week when I brought up Hegel and his idea of how history works, the procession of the world's spirit, where you've got the thesis, the antithesis, and then the sublation. And the people who lose out in that historical process, what we might call history's victims, the people who end up on what Hegel calls the slaughter bench of history, Vergil really calls our attention and our sympathy to these characters, and Dido is one of them. She didn't do anything wrong. She ends up being the pawn of these two divinities, one of whom is trying to ensure the course of history, and the other of whom is trying to frustrate it. Even though she's trying to frustrate it in favor of the very city whose queen she is manipulating to her destruction. And this is why, again, I think some of the real power of Vergil's poetry is in making us look to what maybe a neoconservative would call history's losers. And I bet you, and Hegel would say that too. That's why Hegel's philosophy of history may be good to think with, but it's ultimately very grim. Now, if we jump ahead for a second to Book 5, and we'll get to Book 5 next week, you can just skim it. As Aeneas is sailing away from Carthage, this is after Dido's suicide, after the funeral pyre, that's what he's seeing. Think the end of John Noble, Denethor, and Return of the King. As it's sailing away from Carthage, by now Aeneas was out at sea with his fleet, holding course through waves darkening under a cold north wind, and looking back at the walls of Carthage lit with the flames of Dido's pyre. The cause of the fire was hidden, well, not to us, the reader, but it is to Aeneas. He won't realize what's really happened until Book 6, when he goes to the underworld. But again, waves darkening, he's sailing away at night, but he still sees that beacon far off of what he does not yet know is Dido's funeral pyre. So this darkness and shadow imagery really frames the whole narrative of Book 4. Book 4 begins and ends, jumping into Book 5, with the juxtaposed image of fire and blindness. Now, you might say again, well, that's Book 5, the beginning of that you read, Dr. Wright. But as we'll see also in the division between Book 6 and 7, which is also the division between the first and second halves of the poem, Vergil will often play around with these book divisions a bit. He might include some at the beginning of Book 7 that you think would be at the end of Book 6. So let's see what interpretations we can make when we read Book 4 with this darkness and shadow framework in mind. So, again, we are back in the court of Carthage. The flashback of Books 2 and 3 of the destruction of Troy and Aeneas' wanderings, which catch us up to the beginning of Book 1, are over. So now it's no longer an I narrator, the narrating Aeneas. We're back to our third person omniscient poetic narrator, whom we'll call Vergil. And so, what's going to happen next? There's what Aeneas wants to fulfill his mission and to go on and found eventually Rome, although he wouldn't mind some rest. And there's what Dido wants, which is Aeneas. And we've already mentioned that lying behind the relationship, whatever we want to call it, and as we'll see, Aeneas and Dido end up calling it very different things, are the machinations of especially Juno, the queen of the gods, and to a lesser extent, Venus. We will see Jupiter again, but he's really there to make sure history stays on track. And ultimately, we have the tragedy of Dido, comforted here by her sister Anna, who ends up sort of being a go-between between Dido and Aeneas. Eventually, at least to Ovid, she becomes the goddess Anna Perenna when she makes her way to Italy a bit later on, having fled Carthage. It's notable, there's a famous story that St. Augustine, bishop of Hippo in Carthage, so appropriately in this area, this was the most affecting part of the Aeneid for him. He famously recounts for us how he cried at the death of Dido. Now, maybe Dr. Wright is a very hard-hearted person, but I have never been as moved by Dido's death as I am by the death of Priam in Book 2, after he has just seen his son murdered in front of him, because you're meant to recall the end of the Iliad, the dad, father-son stuff in there. And for whatever reason, that gets me a bit more than the death of Dido. So maybe I'm not as nice a person as St. Augustine. That's not true. I'm much nicer than him. Read some of his later sermons. They're very hateful. He would vote for Trump if he were around today. That's my hot take for this week. All right, let's get back to our darkness and shadow imagery. Dido, now confronting Aeneas because she has learned that he's leaving, she says, "If there is any power in heaven, you will suck down your punishment on rocks in mid-ocean," calling Dido's name over and over. So this recalls, one, on a lesser extent, the death of Ajax, Oilean Ajax, that really metal image I talked about earlier this week in Book 1, where he's impaled on a rock by Minerva breathing out fire. But also the very storm that Aeneas almost died in, and the shelter he got from that storm was, of course, in Carthage with Dido. "Gone I may be, but I'll pursue you with black fire." There's that imagery again. And when cold death has cloven body from soul, my ghost will be everywhere. This itself is somewhat of a metal image. So there's our imagery again, black fire. Here, same word for fire, ignibus, but atris, black, shadowy, awful. This is actually the root of our word atrocious in English. Later on in Book 4, Dido, making a sacrifice of herself to the gods, says, O sun, fiery witness to all earthly deeds, and Juno, complicit in my unhappy love, more than she knows. Hecate, worshipped with howls at midnight crossroads, avenging furies and gods of dying Elissa, which remember is just another name for Dido. Attend to this. Turn the force of your wrath upon sins that deserve it. Oh, hear my prayer. In the Punica of Silius Italicus, written under the Roman Empire, which is in many ways meant to be a self-conscious sequel to the Aeneid. Silius was kind of president of the Vergil fan club of sorts of his day. He brings up a story. He didn't invent it, but it dates probably to the 2nd or 3rd century BC, that Dido, as Aeneas left, also lets out a curse. We see hints of this in the Aeneid as well, that her people, the Carthaginians, will always hate and fight against the Romans, hence the Punic Wars. In the Punica, Hannibal, who's really the central figure of that epic, because there are many different Roman generals like Scipio and Marcellus, but then there's just the one Hannibal. His father, the awesomely named Hamilcar Barca, which is Punic for the Thunderer, makes Hannibal swear on an altar to Dido an undying hatred of the Romans, and so much so that he marches over the Alps with a bunch of elephants to try to conquer them. So we start this quote, the opposite of this darkness imagery, sun, fiery witness to all earthly deeds. There's our fire again. But it's contrasted with Hecate, an underworld goddess, goddess of witches and witchcraft, always invoked and prayed at night, just like we see, worshipped with halls at midnight crossroads. Trivia, the 3 ways, the crossroads is another name for Hecate. Turn the force of your wrath. Hecate, this invocation, and also of the avenging furies, now this is starting to sound like a curse. It is the language of curses, because that is what she is doing. So at the climax of one of the text's point of crisis, the visual imageries of light, sun, and darkness, Hecate, are mixed, just as we saw in Book 2. Worse, Dido now succumbs to the furor, the hatred, and the anger, in other words, the worldview that Juno represents at the beginning of the text. Now, this is appropriate in 2 senses. One, that she is queen of Juno's favorite city, Carthage. And 2, that Juno manipulated her via... I've never been clear how much Venus seems to really know about what Juno's up to. But Juno plays a large part, as nice as she tries to be at the funeral at the end of Book 4 in Dido's fate. So let's talk about her death. Anna, her sister, had reached the top of the pyre by now, and was holding her sister close to her bosom, sobbing as she used her dress to staunch the blood's dark flow. Dido, trying to lift her heavy eyes, grew faint again. The wound hissed deep in her chest. 3 times she struggled to prop herself upon her elbow. 3 times she rolled back on the bed. With wandering eyes, she sought the light in heaven's dome, and moaned when she found it. Then almighty Juno, pitying Dido's long agony and hard death, sent Iris, a messenger of the gods, kind of resembles the rainbow. She sends her down from Olympus to free her struggling soul from its mortal coils. Her death was neither fated nor deserved, but before her day and in the heat of passion. Proserpina had not yet plucked from her head a golden lock, nor allotted her a place in the Stygian gloom. Remember, she's the queen of the underworld. And so Iris flew down through the sky on sparkling saffron wings, trailing in the sunlight 1,000 changing hues, the rainbow, and then stood above Dido's head. This offering I consecrate to Dis and release you from your body. As soon as she had cut the lock, all the body's warmth ebbed away, and Dido's life withdrew into the winds. There's a sort of parallel imagery here, which plays on the fact that Dido dies childless. Remember, she had wanted, oh, if only you could just leave me a little Aeneas. Like, if you could just get me pregnant before you leave, is one of the things she pleads with Aeneas. So Juno is also the goddess of childbirth. The sort of subsidiary goddess she has with that is Libitina. And so Juno can send Libitina to make a woman's delivery go really easily. In the case of Leto, the mother of Apollo and Diana, or Artemis in Greek, because their father was Zeus. So once again, Jupiter had cheated on Juno. She does not send Libitina to make Leto's childbirth as painful as possible. Here you have a sort of inversion of that. It's not the beginning of new life; it has the end of life. It's not. It's not Libitina. It is Iris, and the consecration is to the queen of the dead. So the underworld again, just like in her curse we saw earlier. So again, it sort of emphasizes the tragedy of Dido, who remains unmarried because her first husband had died and she did not stay true to him by having this affair with Aeneas. Now, does that sound judgmental of me? Yes. And scholars debate how much the poem tries to make that a thing, but it does mention that she had made this oath, and her reluctance in breaking the oath at first is what holds her back, even though the gods are pushing her into this relationship with Aeneas. But there's also politics to it as well. There's this figure of Iarbas, this neighboring Libyan king, who also wants to marry her, and she feels that she needs to marry somebody in order to better protect her nascent kingdom, if not Iarbas, who himself is descended from the gods. He too is the son of Jupiter. Then Aeneas and his Trojans, because he kind of comes with an army, would be good as well. And here we might see, and many have, a reflection or a refraction of another African queen, Cleopatra VII, who will come up more explicitly in Book 8. But again, her relationships with both Caesar and Antony are mainly in the service of the welfare of Egypt and her throne. So let's take that passage more slowly, and as we do, we'll pay close attention to how the narrator describes the sequence of events of the last moment of Dido's life, and pay particular attention to how the narrator uses color to describe those events. Then, Almighty Juno, pitying Dido's long agony and hard death, sent Iris down from Olympus to free her struggling soul from its mortal coils. Her death neither fated nor deserved, but before her day and in the heat of passion. So if Dido's fate was neither fated, so not unlike that big book of fate that Jupiter has, nor deserved, as I have really kind of been arguing, then what caused her death? So take note, then, of the disruption that occurs in then Almighty Juno. And so Iris flew down through the sky on sparkling saffron wings, trailing in the sunlight 1,000 changing hues, and stood above Dido's head. Note the irony in the juxtaposition of Dido's suffering, the dark flame, and Iris's splendor, a rainbow. In our culture, a lot of times we think of rainbows as something that comes to the storm or something terrible is over. How do we interpret this scene? Is it what Dido sees? Is it what Anna sees? Is it what the crowd in Carthage sees? Juno effectively interrupts Dido's death, and the narrator correspondingly turns from Dido's vision, looking at the light of the sky, to Juno's state of mind, pity, to the blinding, colorful presence of Iris. Ultimately, The book concludes with Dido's soul falling to Dis, the underworld, a place of eternal darkness. So the take home, and if it's not clear yet, at least in Dr. Wright's opinion, Juno, via her machinations, and then finally by sending down Iris here, is responsible for Dido's death. But that is part of the tragedy of Dido. If you've never read Greek tragedy and you're confused about why I'm saying that a god causing a mortal's death is tragic, this is true of a lot of Greek tragedy. Who kills Hippolytus in Euripides' Hippolytus? Aphrodite or Venus? Who kills Pentheus in Euripides' Bacchae? The god Dionysus. These are just two examples. A facile reading of Sophocles' Oedipus Tyrannus or Oedipus Rex would say Apollo is the one who causes that problem for Oedipus, even though Oedipus himself is very clear at the end, saying, no, it wasn't Apollo, it was me. So this utterly confused movement of the narrator's focus from Dido to Juno to Iris is mirrored in the rapid movement of color, light, and darkness, from the light sky to Iris's rainbow to Dis's shade. In this whirlwind of imagery, we're absolved from viewing Dido's suffering. Recall that while all this is happening, she's dying slowly and horribly on the top of the pyre. We're distracted also from the significance of her death. So, why did Dido go crazy? Not really. And kill herself. She acts like a Aeneid, which is a kind of frenzy. But what has happened here? There is a big shift in Dido between her initial characterization in Book 1, where remember she's explicitly compared to the virgin goddess of the hunt, Diana, a simile that we will see, by the way, again in book 6 of the Odyssey. So the poem's answer is that she was driven mad by her love for Aeneas, love that Venus herself planted on Dido, in order to protect Aeneas from Juno, who fostered, that is, Juno fostered that love by stranding Dido and Aeneas together in a cave, where one of them, Dido, thinks a wedding has happened, but Aeneas doesn't. That's what I mean. They have very different ideas of what their relationship is. And also think about that wedding in that cave, the darkness combined with the funeral, with the wedding torches, but Vergil presents it almost like a funeral, which is proleptic. So why is Juno doing this? She wants to unite the Carthaginians and the Trojans in order to prevent the future Trojans, who will be Romans, from destroying the future Carthaginians. As a consequence of her madness, Dido says this. This is her curse sanctified by her blood. I mentioned this earlier. These last words I pour out with my blood, and you, my Tyrians, another word for Carthaginians, must persecute his, that is Aeneas, his line, throughout the generations. This is your tribute to Dido's ashes. May treaties never unite these nations. May no love ever be lost between them. And again, Silius Italicus, many years later, will replay this as Hannibal's oath, picking up this curse. Our final irony is that Juno's pity for Dido is, in fact, utterly absurd, given her involvement in Dido's madness and death. Juno's actions are a sort of chaos that feeds on itself. So pay further attention as we move on in the epic to the effects that all of these grand issues of fate and Rome's ultimate destiny have on the characters of the Aeneid. One way to think about this, because we haven't mentioned him so much, we've been focusing on Dido, is at a certain point you have to wonder how much of a toll does this take on Aeneas himself. He knows he has a mission and a duty to fulfill, even though the poem says several times he doesn't really understand it. And in doing so, he has lost his father, his first wife, his lover, through no fault of their own. He still has to fight yet another war. He loses his friends. He goes through all this suffering, and for the hope of the future that he won't even himself see. Why wouldn't that drive you mad? At least Odysseus at the end is like, okay, I get to go home and be with my family. So, that's Aeneid Book 4. If you'd like to get ahead, I would say just kind of skim book five. Uh, that might be one where you want to pay more attention to the PowerPoint. It's different funeral games for Anchises, but of the 12 books of the epic, it's probably the one that has the least impact on the rest. But books like 6 and 7 and 8, we are going to want to pay much closer attention to. All right, guys, have a great week, and we will see you on Monday the 27th.